Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin has been one of the most consequential and controversial political figures of the early 21st century. Rising from modest origins in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, to the pinnacle of Russian power, Putin's career has reshaped Russia's domestic politics, foreign relations, and the broader international order. This biography traces his life from childhood, through his years in the Soviet security services, to his ascent to the presidency and long tenure at the center of Russian power. It examines his governing style, key domestic and foreign policy decisions, controversies, and the legacy he is likely to leave behind. Early life and family background. Vladimir Putin was born on October 7, 1952 in Leningrad, then part of the Soviet Union. He was the youngest of 3 children born to Vladimir Spiridonovich Putin and Maria Ivanovna Putina. The family's early years were marked by the hardships of the post-war Soviet Union. 2 of Putin's older brothers died in childhood, one in infancy and another, Victor, during the siege of Leningrad in World War II, leaving a household shaped by loss and wartime memories. Putin's parents worked in modest occupations. His mother labored in a factory and his father served in the Soviet Navy and later in wartime units. Growing up in a cramped communal apartment in Leningrad, Putin experienced the austerity and social realities of Soviet urban life. As a young man, he trained in judo and sambo combat sports that remained an important part of his public persona and demonstrated a competitive streak and physical discipline that would be referenced often in later profiles and state media. Portrayals, education, and early career. Putin studied law at Leningrad State University, now St. Petersburg State University, graduating in 1975. At the university, he wrote a thesis and became known as a diligent student. Shortly after graduation, he joined the Soviet security services, the KGB, embarking on a career that would define much of his professional identity. Assigned to foreign intelligence, Putin served in various capacities, eventually being posted abroad in the 1980s. His time in the KGB placed him within an institution that prized loyalty, secrecy, and a hierarchical command structure. These experiences shaped both his network of contacts and a worldview attentive to intelligence, security, and the levers of state power. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the chaotic 1990 seconds would test many veterans of the Soviet system. For Putin, these years ultimately became a window of opportunity, from intelligence officer to political operative after serving as a KGB officer, including a spell in Dresden, East Germany. Putin returned to Russia and transitioned into roles in St. Petersburg's municipal administration during the early 1990s. He worked under the then Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, a liberal reformer, and gained experience in bureaucracy and local governance. This period helped Putin build a bridge from the secretive world of intelligence to the realm of public administration. He cultivated relationships with politicians, business figures, and administrators' networks that would later underpin his rise. By the late 1990s, Putin's career moved to Moscow. He took on positions in the presidential administration and rose quickly, securing roles that placed him close to the seat of power. In 1998, he was appointed head of the Federal Security Service (FSB), the successor agency to the KGB, and in 1999, he became Prime Minister under President Boris Yeltsin. Yeltsin's sudden resignation on December 31, 1999, when he named Putin acting president, marked an abrupt elevation for Putin and a crucial turning point in Russian politics. Ascent to the presidency. 1999-2000. Putin's time as acting president and subsequent election in 2000 unfolded against a backdrop of political exhaustion, with the 1990s instability, economic contraction, and public disillusionment. He projected an image of steadiness, order, and a no-nonsense approach to governance. His early tenure focused on consolidating federal authority, addressing separatist unrest in Chechnya, and restoring a degree of stability to state institutions, domestic policy, and consolidation of power. 2000-2008. Once elected president, Putin undertook a series of measures that reasserted central control over Russia's regions and key sectors of the economy. He restructured the Federation Council and created federal districts overseen by presidential envoys, moves that critics argued reduced regional autonomy. Simultaneously, the Kremlin strengthened its influence over national television and key media outlets, narrowing the space for independent journalism. Economically, Putin presided over a period of rising oil and gas prices that coincided with measurable improvements in living standards for many Russians. The state reclaimed control over strategically important enterprises, most notably in the energy sector, and rebalanced relationships with oligarchs, who had amassed significant power during the 1990 seconds. Several high-profile business figures who challenged the Kremlin's authority faced legal pressures or imprisonment. The treatment of some of these oligarchs drew criticism from outside observers who described the moves as politicized prosecutions aimed at consolidating political control. Putin's approach to governance emphasized stability, a managed economy, and the centralization of authority. Supporters argued these policies ended the tumult of the 1990s and provided a foundation for economic recovery. Detractors countered that the concentration of power limited political pluralism and weakened democratic institutions, foreign policy, and the reassertion of Russian influence on the international stage. Putin pursued a pragmatic, sometimes assertive foreign policy aimed at restoring Russia's influence in the post-Soviet space and beyond. He positioned Russia as an indispensable actor in energy markets and leveraged state power to secure strategic advantages. The early 2000s saw Russia reasserting itself diplomatically and militarily in its near, abroad. Key episodes that defined Putin's foreign policy include the conflict with Georgia in 2008 and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. In August 2008, a brief war with Georgia over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia led to Russian military intervention and a reconfiguration of influence in the Caucasus. The 2014 annexation of Crimea from Ukraine, following the Maidan protests and the ousting of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, marked a major escalation in Russia's tensions and triggered Western sanctions. Putin characterized Russian actions as protecting ethnic Russians and Russian speakers, rejecting Western criticism as overreach and interference in Russian interests. The Crimea episode and subsequent support for separatists in eastern Ukraine drew widespread international condemnation and a sanctions regime that targeted Russian finance, energy, and defense sectors, domestic politics, opposition, and repression through his tenure. Putin faced persistent criticism from political opponents, independent media, and civil society groups. High-profile opposition figures, including journalists and activists, were subject to legal action, harassment, and in some cases violence. Organizations tracking political freedom and human rights documented a tightening space for dissent, with laws that increased state oversight of non-governmental organizations and curtailed public protest. The poisoning and persecution of critics drew particular attention. Several opposition figures and former intelligence officers who became dissidents either died under suspicious circumstances or suffered poisonings or legal prosecutions. These incidents heightened concerns among Western governments and rights groups about the safety of dissidents and the extent of state involvement in silencing critics, economic policies, and state capitalism. Mechanically, the Kremlin favored a model that blended market mechanisms with significant state ownership in strategic sectors. Revenue from energy exports fueled public spending and allowed for increased social transfers and infrastructure projects. While macroeconomics indicators improved in the 2000s, critics pointed to persistent structural weaknesses, over-reliance on commodities, limited diversification, corruption, and barriers to entrepreneurship. Putin's government emphasized sovereignty over key economic assets and sought to insulate strategic decisions from outside influence. At times, the state used its leverage within industries, particularly energy, as a tool of foreign policy. Underscoring the intersection of economic and geopolitical interests, return to the presidency and constitutional changes to a 1-2020s. After serving the constitutionally limited 2 consecutive terms as president from 2000 to 2008, Putin became prime minister while Dmitry Medvedev served as president. In 2012, Putin returned to the presidency, winning an election that was marred by allegations of irregularities and mass protests in urban centers. The period following the 2011 to 2012 protest movement saw a succession of laws increasing state surveillance powers, criminalizing aspects of protest activity, and labeling some foreign-funded organizations as foreign agents. These measures further constricted civil society. In 2020, constitutional amendments were passed out, among other changes, reset presidential term limits in a way that allowed Putin to potentially extend his stay in power beyond previous limits. The amendments were presented domestically as safeguards for Russia's sovereignty and institutional stability. Critics argued they further entrenched personalized rule and limited prospects for political renewal.